Hello again everybody, welcome back to another Decode Tech video and another video in our Python tutorial series. Last week we talked about lists and what data structures are, and in this video I'm going to be showing you what a tuple is, or some people call it a tuple. So a tuple is really just an immutable list, and I briefly touched on it last week. Immutable means something can't change, immutable means something can change. So a list can change and a tuple cannot change. So let's look at how we can create a tuple. Well, it's very similar to a list. If you see here on line 2, I have a list of items, or what looks like a list, but I have parentheses instead of square brackets. This makes it a tuple instead of a list. And on line 4, I'm printing out the type of my tuple. My tuple variable is storing my tuple, and so I'm just going to run this to show you the type. And you see we get class tuple printed out to the screen. So this is a tuple. And really a tuple is just values separated by commas. So you don't technically need these parentheses. If I take these away and save and run, we should get the same result. But I like to use parentheses because this is easier to spot, that this is a tuple. And you see that we get class tuple again with no errors. So that does work to just have values separated by commas. Now notice that I do have different types of data stored in this tuple. And I forgot to mention last week with lists that you can store multiple different data types in a list as well. The other thing to notice is that just because you put parentheses around something doesn't make it a tuple. For example, if I only had one item in my list here, and I'm just going to get rid of these values here, that is not a tuple. And I'll run it to show you. So I'll save and run. And you see we get class string. That's because we don't have any comma separated values. And this tripped me up one time when I was working with a database. And if you keep watching my Python series, we'll eventually probably get into working with databases. But anyway, something needed a tuple. And so all it needed was a comma after it, even though it was just one value. So I'm going to put a comma in and save and run. And it should now say type of a tuple. And something that helped this make more sense to me was the fact that if you're using an arithmetic expression, you can put parentheses around different parts of the operation to make them have precedence over something else. For example, if you had 5 plus 5 and then did it times 3, that would make the addition happen first and then the multiplication times 3. So that doesn't make this a tuple just by surrounding it with parentheses. Hopefully that made sense and wasn't more confusing. Alright, so since a tuple is like a list, we can index it just like we did a list. So instead of printing out the type, I'm going to get rid of the type here, and I'm going to do my tuple because that's the name of our tuple object. And remember, we didn't get into objects yet, but basically everything in Python is an object, and it has methods most times. And these methods are really just functions that are tied specifically to that object. And we'll look at methods for tuples in just a little bit. But first of all, I wanted to show indexing. So remember, index notation is brackets right after the name of the object you're trying to index. And so I'm going to do an index of 1, and that should give us the second element because indexing starts at 0 in Python. So if I hit start, we should now get 5 printed out to the console. All right, how about searching a tuple? Well, searching a tuple, you can do the same thing you did with lists with the in keyword. You could do if 5 in my tuple, and then say print found it, or whatever you want to do if it's in there. So I'm going to save and run this, and if 5 is in my tuple, which we know it is, it should print out found it. If I instead change this 5 to a 10 and run this, we shouldn't get found it printed out, and you see we get nothing printed out to the console down here. You can also loop over a tuple, so I can do for item in my tuple. And remember, item is just a variable. You can name that whatever you want, but I thought item makes a lot of sense. And I'm going to do print item. So it's going to print out everything that's in the tuple. And I'm going to run that, and it should print it out just like a list would. Sure enough, we get all of our items printed out down here in the console. As far as deleting from a tuple, since it is immutable, you can't remove or add anything to it. For example, you can't use the .remove method, and you can't use the .append method to add things to it. Let's try the .append first. Let's do my tuple, and then .append, and let's try to just append the letter A to the end. And if we run this, we should get an error because we shouldn't be able to add to it. And it says tuple object has no attribute append. And the same thing would happen if we use .remove. Those are list methods. Also, you can't use an index to assign a value. So if I go my tuple index 1, I can't use the reassignment operator and say A either. That wouldn't work because you're not allowed to change a tuple. And just to prove it, I'll run it, and you see we get tuple object does not support item assignment. Likewise, you couldn't do del in front of it like we saw with lists. You could do del my tuple index 1. That would also fail, but you can get rid of a whole tuple by just saying the name of the tuple, del my tuple. And if I run that, this shouldn't fail. And sure enough, it doesn't throw any errors because you can delete the whole thing, but you can't pick and choose what you want to delete. All right, to wrap up, let's look at the only two methods that tuples have. Remember, methods are just functions tied to objects, and so we have .count and .index. So I'm going to do the name of my tuple, which is my tuple, .count, and what the count method does is it will count how many times an item is in the tuple. So if I did name and run this, well, I need to actually print it out to the screen if I want to see anything, and then I'll save and run, and we should get how many times name is in the tuple, and we get 2 down in the console. So that works nicely. And let's try the .index. So this .index will give you the index of where the item is in the tuple. So if I save and run this, we get 0. And so we have name at index 0, but notice we have a second name item in the list, or in the tuple rather. And the reason it gave us 0 is because the index method gives you the first occurrence of that item. So that's something to keep in mind. But let's say I put 5 in here, it should give us the index of 1. And so I'll save and run. And sure enough, we get the index of 1 printed to the console. All right, so that's pretty much tuples in Python. Reasons you might use them are they are faster than list, because since a list can be dynamically changed, whether added to or removed, there's more information that Python has to store under the hood, and therefore it takes more memory to store them, and also it's a little bit longer when you do operations on them. Now, it's maybe only a couple milliseconds or whatever that you normally don't notice, but if you are working with lots of data, it can be noticeable at large scaled programs. So basically you just use them for things that you know aren't going to change. One common thing I see them used for are coordinates on a graph, like X and Y coordinates. And honestly, I don't use tuples a ton, but they are definitely something to keep in mind. And even if you don't use them, you will work with other people's code that uses them, so it's definitely good to know how they work. All right, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section down below. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you have the means, you can support me on Patreon. I'll leave that in the description below. And as always, I hope to see you all in the next video.